Okay, thank you, Dwight. I've been working at the University of Maryland about 25 years now. Since 2004, I've taught and organized the Mid-Atlantic Better Composting School, and I teach composting courses in large animal composting, like horses, and poultry mortality composting, and I also work on some nutrient management for turf grass. So I've been here at the university so long that I'm an institution. And I'm going to start sharing a screen, and I'd ask you all to please fasten your seatbelts because this one is gonna go. Okay, here we go. I'm in the Department of Environmental Science and Technology. At the end of this, the last card will be my business card to give you my contacts. And I'm gonna give you an overview of the science of technology. And people often say it's not science. Well, it's not rocket science, I'll agree, but it is science. It's applied science. And so let's look at composting. We take a pile of stuff and we call them feedstocks. And in that pile of stuff, microorganisms already exist. You don't have to do anything about that. Oxygen comes in from the air and we add water. What we get out when this is over is called compost. It's not the only thing that comes out. We also get water. It comes off as a vapor. We get CO2 and we get heat. If we do it right, we don't get odors, but we will get some earthy smell. And the earthy smell says you're doing it right. If you smell rotten eggs, that's an indication that something's wrong. Okay, why does composting happen? It's all the microbes. It's the little tiny sub-visible stuff going on. The microbes eat those feedstocks. Specifically, they consume carbon. That is their energy source. They need the nutrients to develop enzymes to break down the carbon. So they eat carbon and they consume nutrients. Their activity creates heat. The compost pile itself is the insulation that traps the heat. And as it gets warmer, well, the microbes get happier. And so that accelerates the process. So heat's important. The needs of the composting organisms are basically the same as all living beings. And this is an aerobic process. So they need oxygen, but they need food first, the energy source, which is some form of carbon. They need oxygen, something to respire, just like you and I need. They need nutrients because they need those to make enzymes. We use nutrients all the time. They make amino acids and fats. They need water. The water is pretty high content need for microbes. And they need a nice hospitable environment. For microbes, that means they need the temperature to be right and have a fairly neutral pH condition. The microbes need carbon, nitrogen, moisture, and oxygen. These are what we need to supply to them. And in turn, we get heat out. Now, I've mentioned heat a couple times. We have a definition in MDA that defines compost, and it includes the term heat. It has gone through a heating process. So if you compost in your backyard, that's not compost, that's decayed organic matter. The heating part is really important for lots of reasons. In a horse operation, that heating part needs to be sufficient that the helminth ova that we don't really like to have in horses is killed in the waste. Hello? Now for some reason, okay, there we go. What microorganisms do we have? Well, I'm not going to do a lot with microbiology, but I will say that we have bacteria, fungi, and this thing that's kind of a cross between bacteria and fungi called actinomycetes. The bacteria are what cause most of the heat. They're the first part of the composting. They're consuming the stuff that's easy to break down. Then the fungi take over and start working, as do the actinomycetes. As it cools down, the cellulose, lignocellulose that's in woody products get hit by the fungi and actinomycetes when the temperature begins to cool down. So how do we control these processes? How do we make it do what we want? We have these key process variables. We have the feedstock mix that we control. the pile moisture that we have some control over. Pile aeration, that actually comes from the feedstock. The pile shape and size is what our front end loader does. I assume that most people would be using front end loaders, but talking about equipment is a different talk, so I'm not going to get into that. We have temperature. We do control temperature to some extent. And then we have composting retention time. How long do we hold on? When I get through all these 6 things, we'll be done. So what's the initial feedstock mix? It's the chemical composition, the organic matter, the nutrients, how degradable that organic matter is. Carbon is something that varies in the ease of decomposing it. Sugar water is really easy. Bacteria get into that and take it apart in minutes. Our woody products take a little bit longer. Some carbon will not decay. If you throw pure carbon into that in a certain form, you won't get any degradation. We call that form diamonds. Diamonds just don't compost well. So the organic matter has a wide variability of how well it decomposes. What are the physical characteristics? The moisture, the bulk density, and how heterogeneous that set of feedstocks is. When we talk about feedstocks, plural, we almost always compost with something besides one source. We're almost always using at least 2 things. And the other things we worry about are contamination, cost, availability, and we do have regulations. I promise not to talk much about them. So what's organic matter? It's derived from a living organism. It always contains carbon. It's the energy source. And it contains various amounts of other things: nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur, and all these basic micronutrients that plants like. And they could look like almost anything. This is shredded paper. They can be leaves. They can, please don't try to compost a great big log. It'll take too long. But from top to bottom, the sugars are the easiest and they take the shortest time. And the lignin and lignocellulose take the longest time. And if you have anything else that's more difficult to compost that, you probably shouldn't be using it. The second most important element is nitrogen. It's found in amino acids and proteins. It's necessary for the bacteria and the other microbes to make the enzymes that help break down the harder bonds in carbon so that the fresh plant tissue and the grass clippings can become just carbon and then eventually CO2. We get our nitrogen out of green materials, we call them, and that's grass clippings, green leaves, fruits and vegetables. There's other greens that aren't green because manure usually isn't green. Meat, feathers, hair, blood, all have nitrogen in them. So these are materials that we can use as a nitrogen source. We are most interested in how much carbon compared to how much nitrogen. This mix of the carbon to nitrogen ratio is what makes compost go fast or slow or smelly or not so smelly. And it's one of the things that we can control. We want a carbon to nitrogen ratio that uses all the carbon but doesn't leave any excess nitrogen. The ratio of total mass of elemental carbon to total mass of elemental nitrogen. Oh yeah, how do I do that with a front end loader? Well, I'm going to have to figure out what I want in terms of volumes of my materials. It's different for each material, and we have a way of getting there. How much we express this is how much more carbon than nitrogen. So when I have a C to N ratio of 25:1, that's 25 parts of carbon for every 1 part of nitrogen. It doesn't account for how available the carbon is, and that's affected by the degradability of the carbon itself, the surface area, and the particle size. So you may take a fairly big material and grind it if you want something to happen faster. That can also create problems. So the ideal starting range for C to N is rather forgiving. It could be 25 to 1 up to 35 to 1, and you'll still get a great compost process. So giving yourself a little bit of flexibility is what the composting does for you. If you get a high C to N, greater than 40 to 1, there's too much carbon. That slows the composting process. It also makes the process cooler, so you don't get the heat that you want. There's something called PFRP, Process for Further Reducing Pathogens. This is something that's part of the biosolids industry, but we use it in composting in general. So the temperatures are important there. If you have a low C to N ratio to start with, less than 20 to 1, you have nitrogen released as ammonia. You get off-gassing of the nitrogen, the pile smells, it can make your eyes water. The biggest reason for a compost operation to be shut down completely by MDE is odor. Ammonia is one of those odors, and you don't want to generate odors. So this is just some lists of feedstocks. On the left side are carbon sources. On the right side are nitrogen sources. Some of the things that we're interested in is horse manure itself, and it has a C to N ratio of between 25 to 1 and 55 to 1. So between 25 to 1 and 35 to 1 is ideal, so horse manure is great. Oh, but wait, we're not composting horse manure, are we? We're actually composting stable waste, which means that we have something else in there. So maybe it's a straw, that has a C to N of 70 to 1 up to 100 to 1. It might be wood chips or wood shavings or sawdust. That has a C to N of 200 to 1 up to 700 to 1. And we have wheat straw, which is 140 to 150 to 1. So if we're combining that, because that's the bedding in the stall, with the horse manure, we almost always have a starting C to N ratio that's greater than ideal. We have a couple things we can do with that. We can compost with one of these things in the nitrogen source. So you could add fresh green materials like grass clippings, mow a pasture and use some of that in your compost. That means you have to be able to collect clippings though. Or you can add some other manures like cow manure, which has a low C to N or a high nitrogen content. And you can co-compost your horse manure with cow manure. Those are different approaches. You can use nitrogen fertilizer, plain old urea. I've done that a couple of times with some chicken composting issues that had to get handled really fast. What are the physical factors? What is your stuff made of? If you're using straw, that's a different structure than if you're using wood chips, and yet a different structure if you're using sawdust. Sawdust is a very fine material, and there's problems associated with that. Wood shavings or wood chips are a pretty darn good product to compost with. Straw has its issues, especially if it's not chopped. It decomposes, but still leaves long stringy things that make handling difficult. So there's a structure issue, a porosity issue. Free airspace is something I'm going to talk about, and then finally get to bulk density. But the particle size and shape, decomposition happens on the surface. If you take wood and you shred it, you get a certain amount of surface area. If you take it and run it through a chipper shredder and get wood chips out of it or sawdust out of it, you have way more surface area. The composting will happen much faster. However, these nice, very fine particles here can get jammed into the pore spaces, and they can begin to prevent airflow so you don't get the oxygen you need. Starting to sound like we have a trade-off here. We want to get it fine enough to give us surface area, but we can't get it too fine so that it prevents the oxygen flow. Rigid particles like wood chips provide structure and they help aerate. What's that structure and porosity idea like? Well, we have compost particles, and when we do something, we have pore spaces. That pore space is, and then each particle will have a water film on it. And that pore space is what's left. It's the free air space. It's where airflow occurs. If we don't have this free air space for air to flow in, the composting operation won't get enough oxygen. If it goes anaerobic, we get sulfur compounds coming off, and they stink. In fact, they smell like a septic tank, or they smell like rotten eggs. Back to the statement about odors shut down compost operations. Bulk density is highly correlated with the free air space. We want the bulk density to be low enough that we can get some air through there. The bulk density is the measure of a mass or a weight per unit volume. So we could get pounds per cubic foot. That's the ones I usually deal in. And the other one we deal in is tons per cubic yard. So for example, water has a density of 62 pounds per cubic foot, or 144 tons per cubic yard. Dry topsoil, about 75 pounds per cubic foot. We want our compost to be somewhere between 24 and 44 pounds per cubic foot, or about 1,200 pounds per cubic yard. So this is the way that we can get from the weight that we have in terms of weight issues to the number of bucket loads we need by using bulk density to convert to yards of material. Lower bulk density means greater porosity, greater free air space. If you get below 800 pounds per cubic yard, you're probably getting so much airflow that the pile gets cooled down. So that's the lower level. We don't want to get that. Now, while I'm talking about bulk density, do not drive the front end loader on the compost pile. It crushes it, it creates a high bulk density, and air won't flow. Odor will follow. So, initial bulk density and free airspace. This is the rule of thumb. I want it above 800. I'd like to hit 1,000. If it gets above 1,200, it's too dense and I got to do something about it. The free air space above 50% is pretty good airflow, and that's where this target area is. Feedstocks. We want certain attributes to them. The carbon, the nitrogen, the moisture. We actually have tables of what an example is. But in order to get this for your own compost, you're going to have to take a sample, send it off to a lab, and have them tell you what the carbon and the nitrogen content of each of your feedstocks is. The recipe is how feedstocks are combined. Okay, I've been at it for 15 minutes. We use the recipe to put together the number of bucket loads of one thing compared to the number of bucket loads of another thing. Add water, it will compost. Regulations are partly based on feedstocks. If you have vegetation, just vegetation, the regulations are different than if you have animal manure in it. We call them tier 1 and tier 2. If you go to tier 3 and tier 4, there's way more regulations in it. Pile moisture, the second key process variable. It needs to be wet. The optimum is somewhere between 40 and 60%. I tried one time to get my initial compost pile to be too wet. I used leaves in that pile and it would never get too wet. It just drained. So please don't think that your pile is too wet. It's usually the other way around. It's too dry. Last time we did this composting school, we had the hottest piles we'd ever had, which was what we were looking for. And it was because it rained every day. That was the thing that gave us the heat, the moisture. 65% moisture content means the pore spaces are filled too much and you can get anaerobic conditions. Most of the rough materials, such as wood chips, you're just not going to get to 65, it'll drain. Below 40%, fungus dominates and it becomes difficult to re-wet. It actually creates a system of places that repels water, hydrophobic. Below 35% moisture, you actually get dust if you move it around. Composting consumes water. The microbes create the heat. The water that's in that heated area converts to water vapor. Water vapor goes out the top of the pile because, of course, heat rises, so it goes through the top of the pile. 25 gallons per ton raises the moisture content 10%. Now, a ton is usually about 2 cubic yards. So for every 2 cubic yards, you'll need 25 gallons to raise the moisture content. Well, if you have 3,000 cubic yards of leaves or 1,000 tons, that means you need 25,000 gallons to get them from 40% to 50% moisture, or 25 trips with a 1,000-gallon water truck. That means that getting moisture in is not easy. You want to do it when you first start. You want water right handy to put it in as you're mixing and as you're building your pile. It just gets harder after that. Pile aeration. Aeration supplies oxygen. Most people are looking at passive aeration. This is an active aeration, a forced air system that you're looking at, where a blower actually sends, in this case, it's sending air into the compost pile and it's going out through the compost. It can also work the other way, pull air in through the compost pile. Ambient air is 21% oxygen all the time. The oxygen consumption gets faster. The rate increases with temperature because the microbes are moving faster, they're reproducing faster, they're metabolizing faster. So the organisms can survive 5% oxygen, down from 21%. But below 10% oxygen, the bacteria start switching to anaerobic respiration, and that can begin to produce hydrogen sulfide. A little bit of hydrogen sulfide is going to get trapped in the compost material, and it'll eventually be again consumed by microbes. But a lot of it will come out with a rotten egg smell. So you don't ever want to get below 5% oxygen or you'll start stinking. Convective aeration is what we depend on to make heat move in most compost operations. The heat generates and is hottest inside the center of the pile. Hot air rises, so it moves upwards out of the pile. Well, it can't create a vacuum because then it starts pulling cooler ambient air in through the bottom of the pile. And this convective aeration is what we depend on for most piles. That means that we can't pile our stuff too high. Otherwise, the mere weight of what you've piled on top of it makes the stuff down at the bottom compress, and air will go up around it instead of going through it. So you'll have an anaerobic section down at the bottom of your pile if you pile it too high. Also, here's a regulation. You can't pile composting materials higher than 12 feet. So there is a MDE regulation there. There's also a 9-foot regulation for something, and I think that's for just wood products. Aeration is controlled by the porosity, or the particle size, the compaction, which is usually the pile height and the density, the amount of moisture. If you put more water in, it creates more weight, so it compacts the pile, and we get less porosity. Without blowers, we rely on that convection. Large composting operations, it's not uncommon to have blowers and having forced aeration, but a lot of aeration is just convective heating, or called passive aeration. Variables are related to each other. If the bulk density goes up, the porosity goes down. If the bulk density goes up, we get denser material, less void space for both water and air. If we have less void space, we have a higher percent moisture simply by compacting it, and we have generally less air. As moisture goes up, air movement can, notice can in this one, go down. As the moisture goes up, it takes space away from the free airspace, and it can significantly block air passages, and airflow will decrease, but not always. It depends on what you start at. So when we increase the moisture, we can block the airflow with the liquid film if it gets too high and starts shutting off these narrow spaces. It doesn't have to shut off everything. It just needs to find some sort of bottleneck where it can close up the airspace by the water expanding. Another variable relationship, as free airspace goes up, aeration goes up. We get higher flow. To a point, that's good. And then at some point, that airflow gets so much that is actually taking heat off too fast, and we begin to lose our heat. And we'll talk about why I want heat a little bit more when we talk about pathogen kill. Now, what about turning compost piles? Let's talk about some facts. Fact, turning equals aeration. Well, no, it doesn't. When you put oxygen in by turning it, that oxygen is going to be consumed within minutes in an active pile. Passive or forced aeration is necessary to get your oxygen levels up. You can't just turn the pile. This is a picture of a pile that has had a blower turned off at time 0, and this is the oxygen content. And at time 0, it starts up here at around 18%, and it drops in 20 minutes down to about 3%. And it stays down here until the fan comes back on at 40 minutes and the oxygen content goes back up. So the oxygen you put in by turning is gone in 20 minutes. Turning increases porosity. In fact, it does just the opposite. When you turn a pile, the feedstocks get agitated, and the particle size has either been reduced by composting or the equipment will reduce it when you turn it, and the smaller particles now, as we agitate it, can get into the pore space that was existing before and block up pore spaces. So you actually decrease the porosity when you turn it. To some extent, that's okay. Turning cools the pile. Well, that's another myth. It cools it temporarily. It'll drop down to roughly just a little bit above ambient temperature, but within hours, it will be back up. When you turn the pile the first time, the temperature will probably go higher than it was on the first compost operation, because you've turned some material into an already active compost pile, and you've turned the outsides to the inside, so you're actually going to have more fuel, and it's going to go up higher and faster. Turning can have a permanent cooling effect during the late stage of composting, when all the heat generation is no longer active. Turning speeds decomposition. Is that a fact or a myth? Well, that's a fact. When you turn, decomposition happens faster. So if you throw that turning on day 7, say, you're going to release gases, you're going to expose fresh surfaces, you're going to break apart lumps, and you're going to redistribute moisture, nutrients, and the microbes themselves. And so you'll get quicker decomposition than if you just let it sit. If you get an anaerobic lump, it takes forever for that to decompose without turning. Okay, that's aeration. What about pile shape and size? Emily, tell me how I'm doing on time.
We've got a little more than 15 minutes left.
Oh, okay, I think I can do this. Pile shape and size. The smaller piles allow greater airflow, especially to the center of the pile. The larger piles keep the temperatures higher, so there's a trade-off. If it's too large, it compacts the bottom of the pile. You can have a bigger pile if you have good structure, which means you have maybe sticks and chips of wood in there in addition to maybe sawdust, You can have a higher C to N ratio, you get a bigger pile. You get lower bulk densities, you can have a bigger pile. But your equipment needs to match the pile size. In terms of pile shape, you're going to make sort of a dome, and you're going to live with that unless you need moisture. If you need moisture, then flatten out the pile and let the rain fall on it and collect moisture through the rainfall rather than having to move water. Temperature. Temperature is your best feedback mechanism to know if you're doing it right. At this temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, compost ain't happening. This is pretty much outdoor temperature. Higher temperatures result in faster decomposition up to a limit. If the temperature gets too much above 160 degrees, you begin to lose microbial diversity and composting actually slows. I never get worried until I get above 165 because I find that that high temperature really works well. It's a little bit difficult to get there. You have to have the right moisture, but you can get there. That probably also means you're going to need a thermometer to keep track of what's going on. Most weeds and pathogens are killed at temperatures above 131 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperatures in degrees C are in there because that's where the regulations were set, but we use Fahrenheit to communicate with real people. 3 temperature phases of composting. The first one we call mesophilic, and it's somewhere between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 104. The second phase happens fast. It's thermophilic. It's 105 up to about 150. If it goes above that, it's no longer thermophilic, but we're not going to get into the technical name of what is an actual psychophilic temperature. I'm not going to worry about that. The third phase is it drops back to mesophilic. And so it's less than 105 degrees Fahrenheit again. In pictures, it looks like something like this, where really quickly it heats up. Say, this looks like about 154 degrees Fahrenheit. What are these dips? These are when the pile gets turned. They dip down and go right back up. And then this final dip, most of the easily available carbon has been used and the pile starts to turn or starts to cool. And no matter what you do, it's not going to heat back up unless you add more carbon and more nitrogen. And so this is what it looks like with time. That's where the mesophilic is. It happens in days. If this hasn't happened in 7 days, I get worried. If it hasn't happened in 14 days, it won't happen. And so you need to try to figure out why you're not getting what you need. The thermophilic phase is this one in between. And then at about somewhere around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, you drop back to another mesophilic stage. We call this curing and maturation, becoming mature. It's an important part of the compost operation. You can't take it out once it cools down and put it to use right away, or it'll kill what you're trying to get it to help. So this is a typical compost pile temperature profile, same as the other one. We have ambient temperature in here. This one goes up a little warmer. But if we get too hot, our good bugs are killed off. At about 140 something, weed seeds are killed off. We want that in our compost. We want the weed seeds to be inactivated. At about 131, most pathogens are killed. Because we're talking about horses today, we have this place at around 138 degrees where helminth ova are killed. And the helminth is a parasite that horses are particularly prone to. So we need it up to around 138 degrees Fahrenheit to kill off any helminth ova if we're going to use that compost anywhere around horses. So time, mesophilic a few days, thermophilic 3 weeks to several months. The bigger the pile, the longer this thermophilic will last. Curing and maturation is 1 to 7 months. And that eliminates the inhibitors, chemical inhibitors to seed germination and crop growth. If you put it out right away and plant seeds in it, the germination is going to be inhibited by things from the thermophilic phase. When is the pile done? Well, when the temperature is about 10 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature, then you're getting done. About 1/3 of its original volume, maybe only a half in horse composting because we have so much wood chips in a lot of horse stable waste. You can't recognize the original materials. You don't see chips anymore, and I'll make an exception for that in a minute. But you can't recognize the original materials. The horse manure itself should be completely unrecognizable. It's a dark color, earthy smell. It's stable. That means that the activity has diminished. We call it mature if it'll grow plants. How do you test maturity? Well, if you can find one, you get a styrofoam cup and you put some of the compost in it, plant about 3 bean seeds and give it a little water. If they grow and they don't look deformed, it's mature. If not, well, you need to let it age a little longer. But 3 bean seeds in a styrofoam cup is a pretty cheap test. How do you test for doneness? There are lab and facility tests in addition to throwing some plant seeds in it. So in summary, what conditions do we want for the initial compost material, the initial mix? These are conditions. I'm not going to read everything to them. You're going to have my presentation, but this is the target that we look for. Nothing in here that I need to go over again. What do you think you need in terms of I got to buy something? Well, you're going to need some feedstock analysis. These cost around $35 per analysis, and you send your material off to the lab. They'll handle it for you and send you a report back. You got to have a water source. It's really nice if you have a water source right where you're composting. For pile aeration and shape and size, you don't need anything additional because I know you've got a front end loader already. Aeration is mostly what your original mix is. For temperature, you need thermometers. Usually 3 thermometers, unless you're doing like 6 horses, 3 thermometers is pretty much the minimum. They're about 100 and I'm guessing they're getting close to $140 per thermometer. They're 36-inch long thermometers, so you can get the tip into where the compost action is. What do you need for time? You need a logbook. You want to keep records of that time and temperature. What day is it and what was the temperature? Keep those records, and I keep it on an Excel spreadsheet, but you can use a spiral notebook and a pencil. Excel spreadsheets let me make pictures like the one I showed you, and the picture just tells me what's happening better than a column of numbers does. Okay, and we have a little bit of time, I know. How much time we have left?
We have about 10 minutes, so we're in good shape.
Wow.
You did great.
I hope you caught that all because I was rushing. Are there questions in the chat box?
Yes, we have a few that I've kind of summarized here. The first one you did cover a bit in your carbon and nitrogen tables, but just a brief summary of which bedding composts the easiest or fastest, and how do different manure sources compost differently, like cow versus horse or goat or alpaca, for example.
Okay, cow manure comes in many, many forms. In the older scraper systems where we did an almost dry scrape, that thing comes out perfect. The cow manure is ready to compost. You don't have to do anything. In terms of horse bedding, my least favorite is straw because it's hard to handle after it's composted. It does not compost evenly. The exception is if you take that straw and chop it before you spread it on the stable floor, then it works fine. The next one that I like is wood chips. If you get wood chips by themselves, some of those chips are going to be too big to compost on the first pass. but you can just send them right back through and they'll compost the next time. My most favorite is a mixture of wood chips with a little sawdust in there, because that sawdust will go fast and it'll help with the composting. The wood chips will keep the airspace open and you can get the airflow you need to keep it composting. And what mixer? All of those depend on you having a good water supply in that initial compost mix. And then you get good hot composting. I've been talking with a fellow whose composting temperatures are around 160 and he's using wood chips. I think that's a beautiful temperature. We have more talking to do to figure out why he's getting lumps or wood chips still in his final compost, but we're working on it. And so this is a horse farm that is composting and is getting good high temperatures. That answer that one?
I think so. Another question was about mushrooms growing in the compost. Is this a factor of too much moisture, contamination, density, or some combination of multiple factors?
It's a fungus, so fungi growing in compost is, I can live with it. The mushrooms usually grow because it's pretty wet. It really doesn't have a lot to do with the compost material as it does with it's wet. Remember that mushrooms only grow where the spores will exist. And so those spores have to come from somewhere. It may come in from the feedstock. If it got hot enough, those spores will be deactivated. So the compost probably isn't getting hot enough. Next.
We had quite a few questions about just where's a good place to send the feedstock and compost for analysis and kind of what that cost range is. So we put some links to like our manure lab analysis in there, but
that's what I use. I use Penn State mostly for compost analysis because they do a USCC, that's US Composting Council approved method. But there's lots of labs that do that. And I use your handout.
Good.
So that's what I use.
Great. And we have that linked. Several people have linked that in the chat. So that's good. Another question was, you mentioned that most weeds are killed at 131 degrees. Do you have some examples of some weeds that are a little hardier that survive higher temperatures?
Actually, the temperature for weeds is around 142.
Okay, yeah.
And that'll kill darn near every weed. There's one or two weeds that have a really hard coating that it won't kill. For instance, black walnut. It's got a heck of a shell on it. But most weeds will be killed at 142.
Okay, and then we have a couple questions about persistent herbicides and does temperature help eliminate them, or any other comments about herbicide contamination?
Temperature does some elimination of persistent herbicides, but it doesn't get rid of them. Persistent herbicides that get in compost are, as the name says, persistent, and they will be there for a while. Time is what does the most. The second thing is exposure to sunlight. Well, we're not going to take our compost and spread it out in a 3/8 inch layer and let it sit around for a while. So if you get the persistent herbicide into the compost, it's going to be there for a good year, year and a half. And you can test for it pretty easy. That 3-bean test I told you about will also test for persistent herbicides, because the beans will come up twisted and deformed if you have a persistent herbicide in there.
Okay, and then a kind of a follow-up, but slightly different. What about medications like deworming medication, for example?
A great deal of medications are denatured by the heat or the microbes, because remember that most medicines have a carbon base. And carbon's food for compost microbes. So a lot of medicines will be denatured that way. There are some rings, carbon ring structures that don't break down in composting. So if the medication is made up of carbon rings, it typically doesn't denature completely. But the heat will come along and it'll knock a radical off, allow the microbes to consume part of it, and that may denature it, even though much of the structure still remains. On we go.
Okay, and then one last question is about if compost structures should have a roof or.
That's another 45 minutes discussion, but I will say, if you're going to get an MDE permit, you're going to find it much, much easier to get if you have a pad, like a concrete or an asphalt pad that controls run-on, and a roof that eliminates rainfall. So getting a permit will be much easier with those two structures. We compost at the University of Maryland dairy without a roof. We take the dairy solids out on, I think it's every third day. We put them in rows and we compost without a roof, and the composting goes beautifully. We do use a compost turner, and that makes a lot of moisture go away. So rainfall is basically the addition of moisture. Compost piles shed rainfall once they get built and are left alone. So you'll get some water in them, but you won't get a lot. Most of it will run off of them. It's not like you put plastic on it, but it does run off. I think that's all I can cover on that.
That sounds good. And then we have just two more quick questions, and that'll be it before we move on. Is there a particular design for an aerator or blower system that you prefer, or where can people find resources about that?
Actually, Beltsville USDA designed it. I actually have those pictures, but I threw them out of this presentation to save time. Yes, you put basically a drainage tube at the bottom of the pile, cover it with a little bit of wood chips, and then you build the pile over top of it and attach a blower that pulls air through. Then that air is run to a biofilter. And so that's the design I like. I can show people that design on offline. So just have them send me an email since it's sitting right up there in front of them. If you call the phone number, it'll take a message and I'll get to it either this year or next year. Because we don't go into our offices anymore. So emailing is the way to contact me.
And then the last, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would add one thing on the discussion about roofs and pads. I'd ask John if he has anything to add to that. Oh, silence is golden.
John may have left the call.
He's on. I see his name.
Yeah, he's still there, but he's muted. But
he's not saying anything, so we'll take silence to be golden. Okay, sorry for interrupting, Emily. What was
You're good. The last question we'll get to now before we move on is just what about unfinished compost, and can it harm plants when it's applied to them?
Absolutely. What is unfinished compost? It's carbon that hasn't been used yet. And that takes nitrogen to happen. So if you throw carbon onto the soil, it will suck the nitrogen right out of the soil and your plants will turn yellow. That's the first thing. The second thing is it can increase the moisture content. Well, this time of year, increased moisture content can change the soil itself to a denitrifying condition, because of the moisture combined with the lack of airflow and the carbon that'll suck the nitrogen out. And you can get denitrifying conditions where the nitrogen will turn into N2 gas and go off. And again, the result is yellow plants. So unfinished compost can be hard on the plants that are there, yes.
This is John Sullivan. With regard to a pad or roof for a compost, what I'll say to that is if your compost facility encompasses 5,000 square feet or more, then a permit will be required for that compost site. And it could include things such as a heavy use pad and roofing structure. But that's if it's over 5,000 square feet of disturbed area. In other words, where you're staging your pile And we do have a compost website on MDE's website.
Once you find that website, it's pretty good.